Hello. Welcome all current and future listeners to this session. So today I have the absolute pleasure to be hosting one of our live mentor series with one of our amazing mentors that I'll introduce in just one moment. What are we covering today? So the title of this session is Tips and Tricks to Prepare for Your Next Certification. We know certifications are big in the space, so we want to make sure everyone has everything they need to prepare. All right, awesome. All right, mentor introduction. Who do I have with me on the call today? The absolutely wonderful and very knowledgeable Jack Kay. A little bit of Jack's background. He currently is a cybersecurity engineer focusing in on Azure Security Stack, which is a lot of fun. Of course, a background and a BS in cybersecurity and information assurance that he has leveraged along the way. And of course, we see all these certifications below. That is why he is here with us. Being our resident subject matter expert on certification prep. We see some of the big ones down there: CISSP, CYSA, some of the GCIH, GOSI, and some of the GRIM certifications. Lots and lots of experience in prepping for certifications. So we're super happy to have him on the call and get some of his insight. Awesome. So let's get into the next slide. All right. So Jack, what is the most challenging certification you have prepared for in recent history?
I would have to say it's kind of a tie between the GRIM and the CISSP. CISSP, because it's not necessarily that the material was that hard. It was that it was such a broad amount of material to kind of digest and test upon, even though it wasn't super technical. And I actually kind of did CISSP pretty quickly in getting into security directly. So I was kind of having to learn and assimilate a lot within a short period of time. The GRIM, though, was more recently. I've done that in the last couple of months. And that was just more because I've never done anything with assembly. I've never done any malware analysis, and GRIM is actually associated with the SANS class, is the GIAC reverse engineering malware class, which is a forensic 610, so it's considered one of their more advanced classes. And I just know that one, I did it within a month, but that's not saying that I did not go over the material at least 5 to 10 times over and over to get a lot of those concepts. CISSP was more just hitting the information over and over, and GRIM was more of it took me a while to get the understanding of the material more than anything else.
Interesting. So some of that more advanced content was a little bit harder to pick up.
Yeah, it was all completely new to me. The behavioral stuff I kind of was aware of, but when it came to actually a big portion of it was getting into Ghidra and doing malware analysis on the assembly level side, which I had never done before. So that was completely new, and just kind of learning the basics of that. And then kind of once you get a grasp of that, it helps with the rest of the course. But the problem is that's introduced in, say, day 2 of 5. But what happens is 90% of the people that go and do the course, day 2 information takes a while to kind of get under your belt. But that's the building block for almost majority of the rest of the class.
Awesome. Appreciate that insight. So now I can see we have clearly baselined your skills with some of these advanced certifications. So let's get into the stuff that is widely applicable to everyone out there. So next question, Jack, is going to be, how do you manage time between your full-time job, of course, studying, and your family priorities while preparing for certifications?
Yeah, the best way I have, just to kind of not use up all my time, is because I live in the DC area. I often, well, not now, I was commuting through Metro, where I had about an hour or so commute both ways, coming and going, where what I would do is I would either get a mobile app that has practice exam test beds, so I can kind of cycle through those as I go. And then also what's been really big for me in the last couple of years is I have one of my old kids' Kindles, Kindle Fire tablets that does text to speech. So whenever I get these study guides for Security Plus, CISSP, or any of the certifications, I do that with headphones, say on the train, and I do text to speech there so I can read it as I'm listening to it to help me concentrate, because I have ADHD and my mind wanders very frequently. So I found that method of studying and reading material, I absorb a lot more, because it's easier for me to drown out all outside noises because I have headphones on. But then also it's like I'm reading it in my head as I'm hearing it read to me.
Makes a lot of sense, and I like being able to leverage, your downtime and your commute and things like that. I think that makes a lot of sense for maximizing the hours in the day because everyone has the same amount there. So appreciate that insight, Lazy Gamer. Sorry, Jack. So next question is recommendations around taking practice exams as well as using study guides.
One thing I'll say about study guides in practice tests, depending on the subject matter for the cert, if the certification, I feel there are some certifications that build on others where there's a lot of overlap. If I'm taking a certification that has a lot of overlap, for example, CCSP and CISSP, the ISC Square CCSP is a more cloud centric exam as far as security, but it's heavily influenced by the same concepts that would be on a CISSP. So, for example, for ones like that, I may kind of start off in the beginning where I'll do some of the practice exams or the questions before I get to the material. Because in some cases, you can decide, hey, there's good portions of the material that you kind of already know, and that you may not have to focus on going through all the material all over again. If, like, say, 50% of it is kind of common knowledge with other things you have studied. Um, Outside of that, if I'm studying material that's completely new and I feel like a lot of it doesn't have overlap, I usually keep my practice exams till after I've done at least one through of either the video, if there's like video training and labs through Cybrary, or what I normally also do is get like Cybex and a couple other publishers, their official study guide books, where again, I do the thing I was mentioning before, where I get the Kindle version, I do text to speech, and I do at least one read through, listen through of all the books before I do the practice exams. And then once I get to the practice exams, that's where I highlight what are the concepts where, like, did I guess it? Did I actually know it? That I completely have no idea what the answer was and either guessed wrong or right. But on a real test, I'd rather know it than just kind of hopefully stumble into it. So the practice exams is what I use to kind of determine what I do or don't know as far as what I've studied. And I usually try and get a lot of different sources, including Cybrary, and a lot of companies have apps on their either iOS or Android, where they'll have, say, test beds of 1,000 questions, and I'll do like 20 questions at a time and rotate them through them, so I'm not memorizing answers. But then also, I like how the practice exams. A lot of times, there's a setting where it'll tell you what the correct answer is and tell you why. Because I found that in some certification trainings, there's been stuff that was on, say, that app or on the practice test that I don't necessarily remember anywhere in the book that touched on that very specific question. But having gone through the practice questions and their explanation of why the answer is what it was, I've actually learned some stuff that have helped me prep. To where if I would just like, oh, let me go read through this 1,000-page book again to find this one thing that may not directly be listed, that's something I've found very beneficial with practice exams, especially if you have multiple sources. And again, the mobile app helps me just because, commute back and forth. If you have something where you have 20 minutes here, 10 minutes here on a break, you don't have to literally go on a computer to pull up the exam itself. You can just do it in bits and pieces.
I like that a lot. I definitely like the methodology behind using the practice exams to help baseline areas that and maybe need to go back and double down on. I know on the platform, some of our Kaplan practice exams do offer that functionality for having answer explanations and things like that. I myself use that a lot of times too. It's super helpful, as you mentioned, to gain the cognitive understanding of why the answer was correct and why the others are incorrect. So I appreciate that insight. That was awesome. Jack. All right. So next question. So certs online versus sitting for certification exams in person. Is there a difference in preparing if you were to go and take one?
Majority of the ones I've taken have been in person. But I have taken a couple recently, just because majority of the certs that were listed at the beginning, I've done almost all of those in the last year. What I found with what I like about the virtual remote ones is if you have the space in your home or somewhere where you can kind of designate a space that is set up for whatever the requirements are in most of the online virtual tests. I always find that more beneficial because then I don't have to worry about, getting to some center, signing in, going through their process. A lot of times you're going to have a more comfortable environment and be more relaxed in your own home, where you're not, and because I've gone to some testing centers that were not ideal. We're just kind of bare minimum. Here's an uncomfortable chair to sit in for 4 hours for CISSP or something like that. It just always is a lot easier, and I feel more calm and less stress just doing it from home. So I always prefer home. Um, I can't really see a reason why you would want to not do home unless you just don't have that kind of environment, like you have kids running around, you have just have a lot of hectic stuff at home, or you just don't have that, set up. Then I can definitely see why going in person would be preferred. But just for me, uh, from as far as getting over the jitters of preparing for a test, I find I'm much more relaxed at home.
Awesome. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so one thing, if you were to double down on, you would say it's absolutely critical to have your safe space, your quiet space for that extended period of time if you're at home taking that exam.
Yep, the kids' room has a little small desk with a laptop and everything that is set up anytime I have to do any certifications or meetings or anything like that. If I had to say work remotely, I have a nice little area that I can always just go sit over there, and I have something that's presentable that I can at any time, flip up, set up, and I'm good to go without worrying about all the background stuff.
I love it. You have everything in order there. Obviously a veteran at it. Cool. So next question, Jack, is so any advice for those that are currently preparing for a certification?
Yes. Let's kind of go down the line. The one thing is really utilize the practice exams. And the problem I see some people have with them is, for example, and I've fallen to this as well at some point. Sometimes you'll go through the practice exams and you'll not do stellar, but then there'll be multiple questions that you kind of second guessed yourself on. Where like, well, I knew the answer, I just picked the wrong one. The problem is you just because you may have felt like, well, hey, it was between these two answers. If you didn't know it and you were kind of second guessing yourself, you probably don't know the material as well as you think you do. That, or you need to kind of build your confidence on what you know and what you think you know. Because sometimes you may know the answer, but you just lack the confidence. And if you're going into practice tests where you're not, like, I would say, targeting maybe 80% or more consistently on them, you're going to have issue because you want to give yourself leeway, because the practice exam and your actual exam are never going to be a one for one. Like if you get an 80, you're definitely going to get an 80. One example of that is I got my last practice test for the GCIH, got an 80 on the exam, but there was a couple that I was like, oh, I should have got that. Got a 97 on the final. So like it definitely, there's some fluctuation in that. And as far as, okay, multiple sources. Sorry, because I kind of went over the first two. What I like for multiple sources is I don't suggest just read a study guide or watch a video and you learn everything, or kind of go through study questions and kind of learn it through there. What I find works best for me is usually, especially with Cybrary, I like for the video and the hands-on labs, I'll use that as a source for my audio-visual video watching for a particular class. Like I did it for CYSA, for cybersecurity analysts for CompTIA, and I did it for Security Plus. And then I would get a study guide book, again, Kindle version, text to speech, and do at least one read through of that, listening and reading that. And then again, using the platform in Cybrary for their practice exams, but while also augmenting it with other mobile apps, which majority of the main certifications have some sort of app that they have a free version, or for like maybe $5-10, you can access a bed of a couple hundred test questions just to kind of make sure you're not memorizing the answers. So if you take practice tests over and over, you're going to eventually pull from the same questions. And I even saw that when I took my A+ that I had to take for my degree program, where I literally had a rephrasing of the same question 4 times. And it was just, I don't know, it was just the luck of the draw. But like basically 4 of them were basically about understanding the same concept, where the answer is almost basically the same. But that can also happen in practice exams. I just got lucky that was the actual exam. Also, what I find is like CISSP. CISSP, when I first started like a year or so ago, was like my 5-year down the road cert. But what happened is when I started getting more involved in the community with Cybrary, I started seeing many other mentors and other people in the community that were like, hey, I'm studying for CISSP. I plan to do the next couple months, or hey, I just passed it. And I kind of use that as a driving force for myself. to say, hey, they did it, maybe I can do it, or like, hey, they're somewhat new like me. So I kind of use it as like, hey, what's your goal to finish it? I'm like, I'm going to finish it before you, or I'm going to, right after you pass it, then that means if I haven't passed it within X, like kind of just make it own little personal goals. And I kind of like that the community pushes you and is encouraging. And even if I take an exam and say fail or something, which I've only, I think, done once in the last year or so, but then I like passed it like a couple days later. I just find I like the encouragement within the community.
Great answer there, Jack. So does that wrap it up for fine peers that have that certification? I know.
Well, that, and also I like the in the success stories where people kind of give more information on what worked for them, study habits, or like say, hey, this concept was really bad for me. They kind of emphasize this. That's also very helpful.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that, Jack. As you know, in the community where individuals share what specific things about the course maybe were covered heavily, or some things they would recommend for the next person up to bat. So I think those are definitely some benefits there. Great answer. All right. Next question is how can Cybrary content help you pass your next certification? I think you covered this a little bit in some of the other slides, but Jack, go ahead.
Basically, we have kind of covered it, but if I'm like, say, targeting Security Plus, which is the first, I think, certification I targeted back in April of 2018. I remember that date because when I started my timeline of starting to do certs. And I remember that day specifically because after I did Security Plus, I kind of took a break, and then I didn't start back up on my cert quest until April of 2019. And then basically every cert I've done just about since then, outside of Security Plus, I've done since April of last year. As far as the courses, what I try and do is I try and relate them to work or the kind of jobs I'm trying to get into. So if I have an ideal job, I look at the descriptions of what those jobs are looking for certification-wise and knowledge-wise, and then I try and line them up with the courses and the certification prep that's on Cybrary. And it's like, hey, I see Security Plus used a lot. I see CH or cybersecurity analysts, which, for example, if you work in government contracts, the DoD requirements, there's little slots of what certifications will get you into certain positions. I'll use those and then reference that on the Cybrary platform to get a better idea of what I should focus on outside of the common paths we have. The virtual labs are also very important for getting hands-on, especially if you don't have opportunities, which everyone doesn't, to do their own home labbing. So that's a nice way to offset if you don't have the resources to do home labs. It gives you a way to kind of, use the platform, actually use some of the tools that you're reading about, because then it helps with that retention and understanding for those exams. And again, the practice exams are a good indicator of what you do or do not know. And they will kind of shine light on something like, well, I thought I knew that, but I clearly had no idea. And I just completely guessed on that question. So it's kind of like, hey, do you want to feel that feeling you just felt now when there's no pressure on you on an exam where there's all the pressure on you, where you're possibly coming out of pocket to retake an exam? So I kind of use the practice test to kind of, as a way to kind of gauge, am I really ready? Am I just kind of flubbing through? Because you don't want to do that, then take the regular exam and you fail when you had every indicator on the practice exams. You weren't either going to barely pass or barely fail. That's not a good feeling.
Great insight there, Jack. I like that answer a lot. All right, so next question. So how can the Cybrary community help you succeed? Again, I know this is one that you mentioned a little bit in the previous slides, but definitely a very popular question. Jack, I don't know if you attempted to answer, but you are still on mute, so I'll go ahead and read it again.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I
No
clearly
worries at
was.
all.
I hit the button. It didn't register. So that was harking back to the CISSP where I just saw so many people giving other resources and basically their game plans that they did with CISSP. I saw people that were like me, didn't have a huge amount of experience in security, but were like taking it and acing that exam. And it just kind of pushed me into gear where like, hey, let me push up my timeline. Because originally, if it wasn't for the Cybrary community, I probably wouldn't have done any of those certifications I've done in the last year. I probably would still be at the job I was before that doing IT, which there's nothing wrong with that. But I wouldn't be doing security right now because I didn't have that drive. It was kind of like, I'm interested. But I didn't have a lot of supporting mentors and other people in the community to kind of help me on my journey. And that kind of ties into the motivation. Not just preparing for certifications in general, but preparing for trying to move into the field for cybersecurity and getting those jobs. Kind of speaking to people that are in those fields, you get idea of what they're looking for. You get kind of tips and tricks. Especially what I found has been very beneficial to me outside of like certifications is networking. I met a lot of people through my connections on LinkedIn. If I've done a SANS course with people, I communicate with them via LinkedIn. When I go to stuff like DEF CON, I had a company I was lucky enough, they paid for me to go to DEF CON last year. My previous company paid for me to go to RSA before the whole shutdown earlier this year. But even if you don't have those funds, I started going to B-sides. Almost every local area has their own B-sides. And what I find is that networking really helps you broaden out your scope. So like, hey, you're looking for this particular job, or I want a job with say Cisco or Talos or whatever. Hey, I met some engineers from over there. I have a connection there where if I submit my resume to them, I have someone that says, hey, can you make sure they look at that? And that's also with people within the community in cyber as well. There's many people that work at different companies, work different contracts, where it's just another way of expanding out your network. And then also it's a way for me where I'm kind of an introvert in some cases, but otherwise not, where I'm better texting stuff than like being in person talking to you if I don't know you or if I'm not comfortable. And that kind of helps me get out of my shell to where now I can go to conferences and stuff. I'm a little more outgoing than what I normally would be. And I kind of learned that from feeling like I could speak somewhat of a common understanding with my peers from talking with peers here and not feeling like I'm just dumb. So I kind of know at least I have some solid footing so I don't just go to a conference and they're like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And outside of that, one thing I do like myself to do and others do it as well is anytime there's other free resources that are available, whether it's SANS, Black Hills, whatever other companies there are out there that offer free resources that complement the information that is on Cybrary, I always like to share that as well, specifically in the Slack community. Because it's always beneficial, especially now with COVID. Everyone's kind of working remotely. Everyone has a lot more time on their hands. This is the best time to kind of go through huge chunks of cyber material, as well as any other material that's out there that's can help get your skills up so you can get those jobs and maybe get into those roles a little quicker than you initially had planned so you can kind of get more stability. Because one thing about cybersecurity is I haven't worried about losing my job. Not everyone in cybersecurity can say that, but IT and cybersecurity in general, I find because there's such a lack of people, it's a lot easier once you get into the field to kind of get those jobs and stay within those jobs without worrying about being laid off as much outside of, say, maybe government contracting or something like that. I know I went a little off topic here, but.
No, I mean, Jack, I think those answers were phenomenal. And one that I liked in general was you talking a little bit about how the cyber community allowed you to build that confidence in a virtual way, and then allowing you to apply that in a more meaningful way when you were in person, and allowed you to network not only on LinkedIn but in person and conferences. I think those are phenomenal skills to learn and apply in your daily life as a professional. So I think that stuff was fantastic, and also like your piece at the end about once you're in one of those roles, it's easier to continue to grow and stay in it. So I think that's fantastic. All right. So Jack, that does bring us to the Q&A section. Thank you for all that fantastic advice and those answers on the slides previously. I believe we're going to hear a little bit more from you. So we actually do have a couple questions in chat. And the first question is, so this is relating back to taking a certification test at your home and remotely. So the question is, if we have network issues in the middle of an exam, how can you manage that situation? If we go to a testing center, it would be their responsibility, right? So he's planning to take the CISSP exam soon, so he's confused about which one he should choose, the virtual or the in-person exam.
Okay, so I thankfully haven't had many issues where I've had a internet issue. One, I know they always suggest do wired if possible, although I've taken many wirelessly. It really depends on if it's like ISC Square, CompTIA. It depends on what their policy is. I've seen some where, like, if you get kicked out, their policy may be where, like, if you've marked questions to go back on, you may get kicked out of those to where it may auto reconnect, but there may be something that says, hey, you can't go back and change those. That I can't speak on as much for that direct question because it really depends on who is the body, that's actually administering the exam. Everybody like ISC Square, CompTIA, GIAC, they have their own rules and in place. So I would look more on that side for, like, say if it's ISC Square for a CISSP, which that one I took before COVID, so I didn't actually take that one remotely. So I'm not the best resource for that particular entity. But that's something I would ask or look at the terms for that particular presenter or whatever platform they're using. Because again, it's different from platform to platform.
Great answer there, Jack. All right, so we have another question in the chat. The next question is, so what is your recommendation for those who have failed an exam, maybe even multiple times?
Okay, so for exam, like say it's a Security Plus or whatever exam it is, what I often find is, again, the utilization with the practice exams. A lot of the practice exams, in some cases, will kind of highlight what section of the curriculum or syllabus that those questions that you're missing in the practice exam are. Um, what I also do if I'm like, because I think I did EC Council at a threat intelligence analyst one that I just barely failed once, and then I retook it once I like kind of put a mental note of what were the things I wasn't sure of and kind of went back and studied in the material. The best thing is, when you're taking the exam, what are the questions that you absolutely were like 50-50 or kind of weren't really sure you had. There's some where maybe one or the other. What I try and do is make a mental note of all the questions that were giving you difficulty or were on portions of the material that is on the syllabus or whatnot that can be asked on for the exam. Get an idea of what those questions were that you were not as comfortable with, and then kind of hammer down on those, or maybe even ask some of your peers or someone on Cybrary. The thing is, what you don't know. And if there's certain parts of the question where, say, there's like, I really don't know certain networking things, or there's certain like problem areas that are problem areas. If you're taking an exam and just maybe barely failing it, it's best not to have problem areas, because the thing is, once you've accepted that an area is a problem area for you and you don't do anything about it, you've basically said, hey, I'm going to already go into this exam where I'm probably going to miss this 10% off the bat when you start the exam. And that's not a good place to come from. So the best way is identify what are the real problem areas and then really work on those areas, because you don't want to go in an exam where you already know there's areas that you're just not going to do well in starting. That's the only advice I can have, because that's what I did when I did that one that I did fail. I started to realize, I thought I knew this section and I completely kind of don't. I vaguely knew it. And I was like, I really need to go in depth and really go over this and document it out and kind of go through the workflow. Because what I realized is that was a gaping hole where it may not have been every question I missed, but it was like a good 10% or so of the exam that I was like, I was completely unaware if I was going to get it right or wrong.
Makes a lot of sense, and great insight there, Jack. So the next question in chat is, do you recommend buying a practice test book, or Cybrary and some other online resources, practice exams will suffice? So it's essentially, would you recommend buying a book, or are the pieces of content and practice exams on Cybrary, including Kaplan and practice exams, sufficient for certain certification prep? Especially, it sounds like Aparami is mentioning the CISSP.
I mean, in all honesty, I didn't use the only practice exam material I used, or the practice test questions, was the ones on Cybrary. But then also, like I was mentioning before, the mobile apps. I'm very big on there's a lot of mobile apps for individual certifications. And I can't remember which one it was on Android that I used, but when I was studying for my CSSP, once I had gone through the practice exams on Cybrary a couple of times, I basically just had a test bed of like over 1,000 questions on this mobile app. I paid like I said, $510 or whatever it was at that time, to basically unlock that 1,000 or so questions. And I just kept hammering through the questions over and over until it felt like I was easily able to answer and get a grasp of what they were asking and what kind of options they were, providing for me, what kind of made sense. The only thing I would say to offset what's on Cyber as far as from the practice exam perspective is like I said, there's usually mobile apps. And a good thing is, if you're on the Slack channel, a lot of people will have their recommendations like, hey, I use this one, or hey, I use that. I know a lot of times when people ask me that for a certain exam, I'll actually say like, hey, if you go on, Apple Store or the Android Google Play Store, this is the app I use that really helped me. So you can kind of get an idea from other people that have recently taken it, what test beds they've used that have really helped them in offsetting what's already available. Because the one problem you do want or don't want is you don't want to do the practice questions and then you eventually do it so many times that you start to memorize the answer but don't actually know the material. You just memorize the answer because you've been doing the same test bed over and over again. Because that's not going to happen on the regular exam. It's not going to be pulled from the exact same pool of questions that you just did on your practice exams.
I think that's a great piece of advice. Great answer there, Jack. So next question is, so how do you stay motivated while studying and preparing for an exam? Maybe followed by, how do you get started and avoid procrastination?
What I usually do for myself is when I first did Security Plus, Daryl Gibson had a 30-day kind of, this is how you should approach attacking, Security Plus in 30 days, whereas is more putting an outline of how you should approach reading through his study guide book. And what it had like simple stuff was like, hey, day 1, read half of chapter 1, day 2, half of chapter 2, and do the study questions, day 3, review the study questions that you did from the chapter, and then it kind of just built on there. And then it was maybe a day of rest, but it kind of put out a plan of like, this is how you can attack a time frame to get things done. And then what I would do is use either a calendar or like a to-do app. And I kind of would just sit and spend like 15, 20 minutes planning out on a calendar, like, hey, my to-do today is read the first chapter of this chapter, read the second half, do these review questions. And I kind of planned out where like, hey, I want to take this in 60 days. I want to take this in 3 months. And I kind of made a schedule for myself. And then what I personally would do is I would kind of, I play video games a lot. So I'd be like, hey, well, if I don't do my to-do list for this first, I can't play Overwatch or I can't play whatever game I want to play, as more of using those as a reward. And then what I would often do is if there was some guilty purchase that I wanted to do, like a video game or a gaming system or some other thing that is financially fine, but maybe not the best use of my income, because it'll take away and distract me from my studying, is I'll use those as a reward. So after I did a lot of my exams here, I started playing video games a lot. And I kind of went back into that habit of not studying as much, but then I know I'm going to have to start ramping up soon where like, hey, I want to get a PS5 when it comes out. I've gotten to the point where like, hey, if I want to do that, I need to go and do my GDAT, possibly finish CEH. There's like a couple things I've put in place where like, that's a pretty big purchase. Let me knock out these couple certifications and do the proper planning and prep. And then once I do that, and only once I do that, will I allow myself to do those purchases and reward myself.
I love that. It sounds like you're parenting yourself there a little bit, which is absolutely fantastic, right? A proven method. I think that's fantastic. And this next question is, so this may have been covered at the beginning, but are there any certifications you hated or any ones that you loved? Did you find any on the opposite ends of the spectrum there?
I'll say studying for the CISSP, I hated, because I want to say that still to this day, that's probably one of the only exams where I felt half the answers were probably wrong that I put in, but I passed just because of how the way ISC Square does their questioning. I felt half the time like I didn't quite understand it, but then I would spend long periods of time. Because I think that one, I ended up basically using the whole period of time to answer all the questions versus some of them that I can kind of answer pretty quickly. And it's just getting used to the way ISC Square formats their questions. So like when I did CCSP, which is also by ISC Squared, that was a lot easier than CISSP because I'd already gotten used to how they answer their question and the way they kind of trick you or whatnot. Which prepping for that, doing the practice exam stuff is not one-to-one, but at least it prepares you a little bit for that. So I will say that was the main one I had a hard time with and I kind of dreaded and I just kind of get it out of the way. The one I really enjoyed was my first GIAC exam from a SANS class was GCIH, because I just really liked it. Where it's like, hey, we're using Metasploit. Like, hey, that's one of the first ones where we had a lot of lab environments where this is an exploit. All right, now let's actually do the exploit. And then like, hey, let's do the defense for that. And you can actually see how putting in those defensive measures stop those common tactics that people do that a lot of companies don't do the basics. So I really like that because that was one of the first classes or certifications where I actually got hands-on doing VMs in an actual setup environments where it went one-to-one with the material in a way that was different than, say, just studying for like a GCIH or a Security Plus. It was giving me stuff where I, like every SANS class I've taken, I've made personal notes in every book and put little notes for every company I worked at where everything I've learned to exploit or protect against exploitation of, I've then tested my own environment or went to my manager and said, hey, will we protect this? Can we detect it? Can we defend against it? And if we can't, I will use the tactics of what I'm learning to actually apply it to my work environment. And it always usually went off well, pending if you had approval. Of course, I'm not just going to do it and say, hey, let's see what happens. But it was always nice because that's one of the GIAC exams, although they're very expensive. Those are one of the only ones where I actually got a lot of like very basic techniques that I could use day to day in my job outside of the common ones. And this is more for people that not beginning. The GIAC is more, I see people that have been doing security for a while, but want to get a little more technical on that side of it. If you're new, the stuff that's in the different certifications is perfectly fine. I just found that what happened is my ramp of complexity and learning, like within a year or so, I kind of super accelerated to where now I'm got to a point where there's some things that I'm still learning that are on the basic side. But in others, I find that I get more enjoyment out of the super technical things that I have to really, really work for to understand. Like the
Interesting.
The Graham exam
Yeah.
was a perfect example. I hated that prep for that because I didn't know it for so long, but I just kept at it, and I eventually got a good understanding of it.
I think that's a phenomenal answer, Jack, and I like how at the end when you started out, you hit that super acceleration. You can obviously see with some of the certifications that you've obtained that you've definitely gotten more advanced with that, and I like the reward payoff piece of that. But that does look like we are at the end of our questions here, so I think that will do it for us today. Again, I want to thank everyone so much for their time for joining. I hope this session was super helpful. And of course, Jack, thank you so much for your expertise. This was fantastic. I, of course, learned a ton today, like I always do from you. So again, thank you so much for being our guest of honor today.
Thank you. Sorry if I ramble. It's just me.